Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog. I've got a scary story for you today. Two silent spectres, two ghosts in the machine that are waiting in the wings to creep up on you and sap you of virtually every piece of damage that you've worked so hard to build for. It's time to shine a light on them and bring them out into the light. In my last video, I showed you a test comparing the St. Elmo's build with Obliterate versus a FAMAS build with fast hands and perfect focus in the firing range. And I think for the vast majority of people, it would have been very surprising to see that not only did the St. Elmo's build keep up with the FAMAS build, but in the end it eked out a marginal victory even though all talents were fully stacked. Now in that same video I introduced the concept of the first ghost in the machine. That ghost is Undershoot. What I want to do is explain the results that we saw in the range and then explain further the deeper implications that this has in real gameplay. Now on a spreadsheet, the total mag damage for a St. Elmo's and a FAMAS looks something like this. And when you are calculating damage, essentially your spreadsheet will likely tell you that the FAMAS can kill 3 enemies within that magazine at roughly 15 bullets per enemy for a total of 45 inside the 50 round magazine. The St. Elmo's can kill 4 enemies at 16 rounds per enemy, totaling 64 inside the 70 round magazine. Unfortunately, this little ghost appears, and that little ghost is your reaction time. So the human reaction time is somewhere around about 0.35 to 0.45 seconds. Now in the game, we get visual cues leading up to the end of an enemy's life, telling us that we can release the trigger at some point. The variations in crit chance and missed bullets and that sort of stuff don't allow us to perfectly predict when that's going to happen. So we're still reacting, but what it does allow us to do is to keep down the lower end of that scale, around about 0.35 seconds. Now the FAMAS will kill an enemy in 0.83 seconds, the St. Elmo's around about 0.93 seconds, but that reaction time is the same in both cases. So the FAMAS, including reaction time, will still kill an enemy faster than what the St. Elmo's will. But what that does is it changes the number of enemies that we are capable of killing within one magazine. So for the FAMAS it looks like this, and for the St. Elmo's like this, with all 6 enemies in the firing range lining up to look something like this. And this you can see in the examples repeated over and over again, with variance only due to essentially critical hit chance. Now the St. Elmo's, the variance is a little bit larger because it has longer time to deviate from any average for crit chance. So in some cases it does get through to the 4th enemy on its first mag. In some cases it fails to kill the 3rd enemy completely. But overall, this is what the average looks like in the range. The implications for the FAMAS in regards to this reaction time are more significant than they are for the St. Elmo's. One, the FAMAS has a higher bullet damage, or higher average bullet damage, and it has a smaller magazine and a faster rate of fire. So that reaction time, which is equal in both counts as far as time is concerned, for the St. Elmo's only makes up 8.5% of its total magazine damage, whereas for the FAMAS it makes up 12.6% in every single case. Every single enemy that goes down, this difference starts to stack up. So across the course of this engagement of 6 heroic solo elite enemies, The St. Elmo's loses 20% of its total damage per magazine. The FAMAS loses 25%. And we take our starting burst DPS, that reduces both of them down, but now the margin between the two is almost halved as far as their raw burst DPS is concerned. Now, that should mean that the FAMAS still kills those 6 enemies quicker, but now the St. Elmo's larger magazine capacity now comes to the fore, and only requiring 1 reload for the entire 6 enemies now gives it a margin of advantage. Now, many people will say that this is it's only unique to this situation. It's the FAMAS in the firing range against 6 elite enemies and at this distance. But this is actually the best case scenario for the FAMAS with fast hands and perfect focus. Because in the real game, you actually come across different enemy types with lower health values. Unfortunately, your reaction time stays exactly the same. And because variance can play a larger part in lower HP, your reaction time is actually worse. In the last video, I showed you an instance where my accuracy rate was in fact 30% when targeting a red. But even if we were to assume that your reaction time stays completely the same across all enemy types, what you can see is that the instances of where this gap will close significantly increase in real world play versus what you saw in that demonstration and that test that I did in the last video. And here you start to get an appreciation of how much this ghost is actually sapping your damage. But this isn't the only ghost. In the real world, when targets present themselves, we begin firing, we start taking down targets. And at some point we're making the heuristic judgment about how many bullets we have left in our magazine. And if we decide that there's not enough in order to kill that next enemy, we duck into cover and reload. And in this case, stopping 10 rounds short of completing the entire magazine before coming out and recommencing damage with a full magazine. And the reason why we do that is because if we fail to kill that target, we are now stuck with our dick swinging in the breeze and no damage coming out of our weapon. Bad place to be. So what this means in game is that with distinct regularity, we are now undershooting the number of bullets in our magazine and regularly stopping short. If we're killing as many targets as we can with our magazine, then in the case of the St. Elmo's, it's now using 87% of the magazine, whereas the FAMAS is using 75% of the magazine. Now when you combine that with the lost time to overshoot, in regular gameplay, one, you can see quite easily why it is that your accuracy stats are somewhere between 40 and 60%. And then you can also see that any advantage that the FAMAS had by way of burst DPS completely evaporates. And now it's relying on fast hands in order to keep it anywhere near the St. Elmo's as far as damage output goes. The thing is that Undershoot has far-reaching effects. Fast hands is a talent that requires hits in order for you to stack it. And with the FAMAS, what you would have expected being 50 rounds in the magazine times 60% crits, meaning that you would have got 30 hits, overshoot now actually means that you're only getting 23 hits. And this is what we saw in the range. over and over and over again, an average of around 23 critical hits for the FAMAS, stacking its reload speed bonus. But when you take it out of the range, we're ducking back into cover after we've killed that second enemy, the FAMAS is now only using 80% of its magazine, and with Overshoot is now only getting 30 hits, which means that it's only getting 18 critical hits. And that's on elites. When you convert that to veterans, it's still only 18 critical hits. But when you include the most common enemy in the game, being normals or reds, the FAMAS is now only scoring 20 hits on target per magazine. So the average bonus from fast hands will only be 12 critical hits. And as an average in the real world, you're roughly going to get somewhere around 16 critical hits, meaning that what you thought was 120% reload speed bonus, on average, only amounts to 64. And these ghosts in the machines affect a large number of talents, not just fast hands. It causes us to overestimate the amount of armor that we'll get from clutch. It causes us to underestimate the amount of time that it's going to take to get to 75 stacks or 100 stacks when it comes to steady-handed. It causes us to underestimate the amount of time that it's going to take us to stack both strikers and heartstopper. Stopping short of the end of the magazine causes us to overestimate the amount of damage that we're going to receive from talents like Optimist and like Strained, and it causes us to underestimate the advantage of talents like Lucky Shot and also Boomerang. And people make these overestimations of gains and underestimation of losses all the time when it comes to damage. There's people doing it right now, saying, well, what about when you only take one target at a time? That's burst damage. That means that the FAMAS is definitely going to be better in those situations. But you've overestimated what you've gained and you've underestimated what you've lost. For these two builds, we'll kill a normal or red enemy in 4 bullets on average. Both builds will kill a veteran enemy in 10 bullets on average. Elites, the FAMAS build will kill in 15 bullets, the St. Elmo's build will kill in 16 bullets. Now what that means as a gain from a burst DPS perspective is the FAMAS has a faster rate of fire, so even though it kills in the same number of bullets, it gains 0.013 seconds for the normal. It gains 0.032 seconds for the veteran, and in the case of the elite, it gains 0.108 seconds. But now you are going into cover and reloading in order to get back out and start doing damage again. The St. Elmo's will reload on average on these builds in 1.44 seconds. The FAMAS with fast hands has now lost the majority of its fast hands buff. And on average, it's now only getting 2 critical hits for the normal enemy, meaning that its reload, including buffs and weapon handling, brings it down to 1.654 seconds. In the case of a veteran, it's now averaging 6 critical hits, but still has a slower reload time than the St. Elmo's. In the case of an elite, it finally gets enough rounds on target to average 9 critical hits for a 36% reload bonus on top of its weapon handling buffs to finally get a win in the reload stakes. Which means that a net gain on a normal is for the St. Elmo's, for a veteran it's a St. Elmo's, and on the elite only is it a net win for the FAMAS. Totaled all up, roughly the same, except when you realise that a normal and a veteran occur in total twice as often as an elite does. So I reiterate that in the range, that test was the best case scenario for the FAMAS. It was allowed to use the full capacity of its magazine, and it was getting the maximum buff from fast hands that it possibly could. Not only that, it was at the absolute maximum stacks, which for perfect focus takes 10 seconds to reach. So when you factor in that some of the times that you've gone back into cover is because you've taken a grenade, and that will knock you out of the perfect focus bonus, and you'll have to start from scratch again. When you take into the fact that that test was at a 2% deficit of crit chance to the St. Elmo's, when you take into the fact that every 100 rounds the St. Elmo's is going to be shocking targets, improving its accuracy and rounds on target in that regard. Not only that, but preventing damage from coming in by use of a crowd control aspect. I stand by my claims that the St. Elmo's is better than the FAMAS, even with a damage talent. But that wasn't the point of this video. The video was to point out that the reason why people thought that the FAMAS with perfect focus and fast hands would be better is because of a spreadsheet and without awareness of these ghosts in the machine. If you like, then like. If you want to see more, subscribe, but I will see you in the next one. Fog out.